are now with a listening audience. So there, hey, look at that. You put everything up and you kind of bring it back down a little bit. And you get in front of the mic. And hello, my name is Jamie Yarbrough, and I'm here with Joan Miles, and it's Joan Miles' program, and we're going to talk about
political conflicts.
Political conflicts.
Right.
Well, you know a lot more about that than I do, so fire away.
Okay. The fundamental conflict, political conflict in America today is, as it has been for a century, individualism versus collectivism. Does the individual's life belong to him, or does it belong to the group, the community, society, or the state? With government expanding ever more rapidly, seizing and spending more and more of our money on entitlement programs and corporate bailouts, and intruding on our businesses and lives in increasingly onerous ways, the need for clarity on this issue has never been greater. Individualism is the idea that the individual's life belongs to him and that he has an inalienable right to live it as he sees fit, to act on his own judgment, to keep and use the product of his effort, and to pursue the values of his choosing. It's the idea that the individual is sovereign, an end in himself, and the fundamental unit of moral concern. This is the ideal that the American founders set forth and sought to establish when they drafted the Declaration and the Constitution and created a country in which the individual's rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness were to be recognized and protected. Collectivism is the idea that the individual's life belongs not to him, but to the group or society of which he is merely a part, that he has no rights, and that he must sacrifice his values and goals for the group's greater good. According to collectivism, the group or society is the basic unit of moral concern, and the individual is of value only insofar as he serves the group. As one advocate of this idea puts it, man has no rights except those which society permits him to enjoy. From the day of his birth until the day of his death, society allows him to enjoy certain so-called rights and deprives him of others. So, just as a personal opinion about life, life is a struggle between good and evil, between right and wrong. Good and God are the same thing. And as an individual, you need to fight for what you believe in. Have a lust for life. Struggle to learn who you are. Find your voice. The Bible says, know thyself. Compete for your self-fulfillment and self-realization. Now, in the conflict, we'll pin it down to the capitalists and the Republicans and the Democrats. I think you know who is who. The individualists would be the capitalists. The collectivists would be the socialists and the Democrats. What I would like to see is they're both competing for power. We're all competing for power. The individuals, and if you're not, if as an individual, you're not trying to claim your power, you're not paying attention. So, but what I think we should introduce into this conflict is fairness. This is an element that we don't talk about a lot, and I would like to bring it down to the conflict about about Brett Kavanaugh and the accusation against him. Chuck Schumer spoke out and said, we're not dealing with due process here. There's no presumption of innocence and no presumption of guilt. And this is not our system. It's not fair. And this is my complaint about the process. And I wondered why, if we're inspecting all about Brett Kavanaugh, why aren't we talking about Christine Blasey Ford, who has been exposed for ties to Big Pharma, abortion pill maker. And I haven't heard any news about this. Why aren't we investigating her? She claims without any evidence that Kavanaugh inappropriately touched her at a drunken party while in high school. She turns out to have ties to an abortion pill pharmaceutical company called Corcept Therapeutics. This discovery brings to light an obvious conflict of interest in Blasey's story, revealing that she worked for a pharmaceutical company that manufactures an abortion pill drug whose profits would be strongly impacted by future Supreme Court decisions on abortion rights. Corcept Therapeutics manufactures and markets an abortion pill called mifepristone, and Christine Blasey Ford is a co-author of at least 8 published scientific papers produced by the pharmaceutical giant to promote its pills. You can see Blasey's name listed on several publications at this Corcept.com webpage detailing their research papers. Corcept Therapeutics, Inc., a $166 billion market cap company, reportedly has current annual sales of $260 million. If Kavanaugh were to be confirmed on the U.S. Supreme Court and be a part of a decision that overturns Roe v. Wade, it would make the prescribing of Corcept's drug for abortion illegal, directly impacting the bottom line profits of the company for which Christine Blasey Ford works. she scrubs her internet history to eliminate evidence of hazy drunken sex parties documented in her high school yearbook. Before going public with her baseless accusations against Brett Kavanaugh, Christine Blasey scrubbed her internet history, moving her LinkedIn pages, and even managing to have her entire high school yearbook completely removed from the internet. The high school yearbook of Christine Blasey Ford is full of accounts of wild, drunken sex parties attending by Blasey and others. And, quote, "And there were always parties to celebrate any occasion," reads one passage. "Although these parties are no doubt unforgettable, they are only a memory lapse for most, since loss of consciousness is often an integral part of the party scene." And I could go on. So, Jamie, don't you think this adds a little information that we should be looking at?
Well, odd that you should ask. I was running pitter-patter through a number of conspiracy theories and things that I had learned from InfoWars, and I am well aware of the dichotomy between the haves, the have-nots, the people that have power, the people who want power. I argue about the Democrats and the Republicans, the left wing, the right wing, belonging to the same bird. Yeah, okay, thank you. I do believe that the news that we have, and primarily my news, is all from cable TV, and I am unashamedly a member of the Fox network, or a devotee of the Fox network, which I think is probably one of the more objective news channels on cable news. But I also leave time for CBS nightly news, and I listen to the right wing, throw their barbs in the fire. And I think the problem really relies in the full and open dissemination of the facts. As you mentioned about the scrubbing of the information on the internet, people, Snopes included, all had conversations about WikiLeaks and Wikipedia, and the fact that anybody could contribute, anybody could throw their information in there for public ingestion. Some of it was right and some of it was wrong. And at the inset of the internet, people wondered what would happen when information was just allowed to run rampant amongst a quote-unquote civilized group of people on the planet. And they said, not to worry, it will be self-policing. Well, what you're describing is basically part of that self-policing effort, in that if you don't like what you're hearing, you have to find out, just as in a court of law, what the opposition is all about, which is kind of what the cable news companies attempt to do, and that's engage what they call the court of public opinion. And, of course, the court of public opinion leads to things like populism, and why we have Donald Trump in office, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and there were too many squeaky wheels. So we're in the throes of an analysis of a political firestorm, so to speak, one where in our system of government, we have the three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. And at the top of the heap, as a third party or fourth party oversight, is the Supreme Court, who's supposed to be doing the interpretation of our laws, the intent of our laws, in the light of what the founding fathers wrote. And it's kind of a coin toss sometimes, because we weren't there. We weren't engaged in their conversation. We are not aware of their thought process. We can only surmise, based on the volume of evidence the history books, their journals, the books that they read. However, jurisprudence has a blindfold on for one reason and one reason primarily only, and that's all stand equal before the law. Justice is supposed to be blind. Justice speaks only in terms of the right versus wrong, which is a daunting task for anybody, let alone the members of the Supreme Court.
So, I'll close this part of the conflict with this opinion. Big government, they want two classes, haves and have-nots, as long as they are the haves. So I leave it at that, and then after you're going to talk about a conversation with a Buddhist monk or
Scholar.
And then I want to talk about a belief that is ruling havoc in the colleges these days. Postmodernism. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, I have.
Oh, brother.
Yes.
And so you have a subject to discuss, a dialogue called The Nature of Reality between a Buddhist scholar and a theoretical physicist. What is that?
Well, I have a subscription to a plethora of different sources. I ran across this conversation that took place in June of 2017 between a Buddhist scholar. His name is Alan Wallace. He was taught or trained by the Dalai Lama himself, lived 14 years in Tibet, and through his studies, collegiate studies, as a PhD in theology, acquired a notable world-renowned reputation for understanding Buddhism amongst other religious disciplines. And Sean Carroll, who is a world-renowned theoretical physicist who got his degrees and his master's in Harvard. He was a fellow at MIT and is currently a professor at Caltech. The format of the talk, which is 122 minutes long, of which the first 20 minutes belong to Mr. Carroll and the second 20 minutes to Mr. Wallace, were officiated by another theoretical physicist his name escapes me. And after that, they had a slight interchange of discussions about the various points that they made in their talks, and then they opened it up to the audience for questions. To do justice to this talk in about 20 minutes is probably doing an injustice, but I'll throw it out there. I don't want to cut to the chase and tell you that the answer lies in the ability to nail Jello to the wall, but I'll start off with Mr. Carroll, who talked about the theoretical view of reality. He opens the conversation saying, one of the things that most people think about science is it is a place to find answers, when conversely, just the opposite is true. Most scientists don't run around using a slide rule or calculator and weights and measures and inclined planes to figure out the nature of why things work. They are usually engaged in finding out what they don't know, because it is science in and of itself is principally a discovery process in trying to find out the nature abhors a vacuum, and the greatest vacuum is our ignorance, or our inability to understand how the real universe works. and our place in it, of course. But that's more of a behavioralist biology portion, which was the other side of the coin when we talked to the Buddhist scholar. Anyway, he mentioned that when you talk about the things we know and the things that we don't know, you can state facts, and the facts can be looked at in a number of different ways. This is not unlike some types of politics. Depending on your viewpoint, your perspective, if you look at a chair, example, you can look at a chair as being made of fabric and wood. It can have foam. It can have texture. But a theoretical physicist would also say, well, it's also made of elementary particles. It's made of atoms and molecules. Those atoms at the subatomic level are guided by the strong force, the weak force, and the two nuclear forces. So to say you understand the chair and you speak about it in its components from a physical standpoint is one thing, but if you can also talk about it in terms of its atomic or molecular, and both conversations are correct. Another situation he alluded to was, I have a cell phone. Mine happens to be an Android, but he talked about an iPhone. And he says, I can look at this phone from 3 different positions. One being, I can use the pad to talk to someone on a telephone. I can use it to use applications as a user. But as a theoretical physicist, he can also go down to the molecular level, and he can talk about the atoms and the molecules that are involved in the electricity and how they flow and why they flow the way they do. And there's even another layer, which he mentions as to how we understand reality, and that's in the electronics. Well, there's a capacitor, and there's a diode, and there's an integrated circuit. And another area that he did not mention, but is still valuable, are the lines of code, which is a whole world of metadata that makes the phone actually do what it does. So when you think about the nature of reality, he says that we look at the universe, the cosmos, from the very large to the very small, and it is usually in terms of layers of the way we look at it, the way it appears, the way it behaves. You interject the amount of time, and you got not just the 2-dimensional, the 3-dimensional, but by having the motion of the objects, either they're atomic or celestial galaxies. This is a 4th dimension. Later I'll talk a little bit about more dimensions. But he said to say that we understand reality is not going to be accurate anytime soon because of a couple of instances. One is called the double slit experiment, which has to do with the duality of light. Light can behave as a particle. It can also behave as a wave. Working with people like Heisenberg and his uncertainty principle, if we look at an atom, we see that it has a proton and a neutron, and it is encircled by an electron. In Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, they look at the traveling of the electron because we know that it encircles the atom, but we don't know exactly where it is. We know where it's going to be, but as soon as we look at where it's going to be, it's somewhere else. Part of the description of an electron is, well, we've never seen one, but we know it's there. And we also know that while it has this path that goes around the nucleus of the atom, every so often it winks out. Excuse me? It winks out. It disappears. We don't know where it goes to. It could go to another dimension, but it is no longer visible in any measurable sense. So theoretical physicists is called theoretical physicists because that's mostly what they deal with. They deal with theory and conjecture. They look at a process and they say, we think it works this way, but we're not really sure. So if you were to say the nature of reality is because of a particle like the Higgs boson that they found at CERN, the Superhadron Collector in Geneva, Switzerland, that is the end-all be-all of why we're here. Well, Stephen Hawking had in his very last speech, it only lasted about 6 minutes, he basically says, all of our answers will be determined more likely when we discover what a black hole is and what is dark energy or dark matter. And with that, the ball game is over. Well, in this short talk, I'll have to go on to the Buddhist scholar, and he acknowledged everything that the theoretical physicist said. Alan Wallace mentioned his credentials of why he was there, and said, well, the physical universe is really important because it is what we are dealing with. But there are other elements of our reality which are very difficult to describe that cannot be quantified. And if anybody out there is a Star Trek devotee, they're familiar with the struggle between Captain Kirk and Commander Spock, or between Jean-Luc Picard and Commander Data. One was a Vulcan, and his training and life had been dictated by logic. And Joan, your paper's up against the mic.
Sorry.
It's okay. And Commander Data, who is an android, and his struggle was to understand how not to be a walking computer. In the Buddhist world, Dr. Wallace mentioned, he says, if you look at theoretical physicists today, the greatest lineage that we are dependent on or are quoting are usually white, male, European, American. The scientists in the science community are, well, for the most part, white Anglo-Saxon type of people that did a lot of studying and did a lot of science. And yet, even though we're looking only back maybe a couple thousand years, but more specifically more about 500 years with the Renaissance, and he says, for the greater part of our understanding of the world in which we are and reality, modern science is ignoring 5,000 years worth of people in Asia. What? Well, you're also forgetting about the indigenous people, and they were around a lot longer, and might not they have another perception that is just as valid about the nature of reality? I mean, think about the Norse gods. Think about the spirit world of indigenous populations in America, the Aborigines who claim to have ancestors from thousands of years ago. When we talk about the physical world, that is only one aspect. Similar to the conversation about the chair, you can describe it in a number of different ways, and both of them are equally valuable. So when we talk about spirituality, or not necessarily Buddha, because Buddha was, for the best part that we can understand, was just a man, he had a perspective that was unique in his time that allowed people to think outside the box, so to speak. Up into the time of Buddha, there were a number of forces out in the world that had either dictated, written down, or through some cultural means transmitted the way people should live and the way people should think. And Buddha basically opened up the gate and said, no, you should basically believe what you believe, along with the individualism. Oh, Joan's waking up. I'm talking about individualism. Yes, it's true. In and as much as every well, let's go back. Crossing the lines between spirituality and physical, particle physics, not particle physics, between, the word is theoretical physics. There is a experiment I mentioned before about the double slit experiment. In the double slit experiment, light is passed through a slit in a piece of cardboard, and it's shown up against a wall. And it creates a line where the particles that go through the slit hit the wall. No big thing. However, when they put a second slit to the side of it, the image that appears on the wall is a interference pattern. It is alternate on, alternate off. It looks kind of like a grill, like bars on a jail, whatever. And that's because the light that's going through, if it is a wave, it is going to the left and the right of the slit. But that wasn't really apparent when you only had one slit. But when it does that, if you have two slits, some of the left-right waves cancel each other out. And by canceling each other out, they create a void in the pattern. Now, if you go to see this process up close and you put a measuring device at the entrance of the slit and one at the back of the slit, you will not be able to observe this interference pattern, which is a kind of a phenomenon that says, wait a minute, if the only thing that I did was look at it closer, what bearing does somebody who is objectively looking at it have? Well, that one person to observe the process has changed the process, which is kind of like saying, well, as soon as we look for the electron, it's not there, but we know where it's supposed to be. All people have different perceptions, which means they have different realities. None of them are necessarily good, bad, incorrect, incompatible. Last time I was on, I mentioned a situation that happened in India about a king who had 7 blind men that got together to talk about what an elephant was. Well, when they each touched the elephant at different parts, they came up with 7 different analysis of what an elephant was. One of them was a winnowing basket. Another, touching the tusk, said it was a plowshare. Someone who touched the foot said the foot said it was a pillar. Someone who touched the back said it was a mortar. Someone who touched the tail said it was a pestle. Someone who touched the very end of the tail said it was a brush. And the last one who touched the body said it was a granary. And all of them were correct, but all of them were incompatible. They actually did not approach the actual description of the animal which they were touching. And yet they were all right. They were all correct, because it was their perspective based on the information they were able to get through the sense that they used. So a lot of times people can have a particular point of view based on their perception of reality. In a small community, it's kind of like, well, if you were a fish and lived in the ocean, how would you know? Because living in the ocean is the only world you're aware of. So that's your perception, that's your reality. Now, as we know, as human beings, the ocean is part of the world. And the world is a big place. It has a lot of different things in it besides water and air. We are also aware of space. So our perception makes a difference in our ability to interact with the society in which we are, because man is a social animal. And being a social animal, he sometimes adopts rules for societies versus the rules that he would use for himself. And there is where we draw the line in conflict. Because, well, I belong to the group, and the group is good, so let's do what the group wants. I want to be an American and live in the land of the free, and I don't want to go to a country that has all kinds of bad things happening in it because of the form of government they got. And yet, I am a member of the National Space Society, and I want all of humanity to get off of this rock and go to someplace else and live happily ever after. But for a global effort, that would include global governance, rules. We have an example, and it's called the International Space Station. There are about probably 30 countries that are involved in the International Space Station, and they get along fine regardless of who's in the Oval Office. Go, Joan.
Thanks. Okay. Another subject I'd like to mention is competition. It's so vital. And the ideology of liberalism demands the role of supremacy and is envious of anything that threatens its place. It cannot tolerate the presence and competitive role of manhood, which seeks independence, self-direction, self-fulfillment, and self-empowerment. Uniquely ensconced in the Judeo-Christian belief system is the theme of fairness and meritocracy. So those two are key: fairness and meritocracy, which would embody competition for merit. The Fabian socialists wanted to get competition out of society. Society would become more productive. People's talents would be liberated from the necessity to outdo each other. Take techniques and attitudes of science and apply them to governance of human beings. So that's kind of an angle on technocracy, right? Science governing human beings. So, this is just another angle on individualism. Adam Smith, in 1838, Darwin's work was preceded by decades, indeed, by a century of research concerning the rise of highly complex, spontaneous, you get that, spontaneous, not contrived, orders through a process of evolution. Not only does all evolution rest on competition, but continuing competition is necessary even to preserve existing achievements. What do you think of that?
Well, in that, yeah, I like the idea of evolution. In another unrelated YouTube that talked about the nature of reality, self-determinism was mentioned as one of them. They looked at like, I think there were like 6 or 7 different things that were involved in the perception of reality. And they tried to say, well, if this is true, then it was true before, it's true now, and it will always be true. And of all of these 6 things, the only one thing that they discovered from the particle, the smallest particle, quark, to the largest structure in the universe, the observable universe that we know now, as a black hole, a huge, huge, huge black hole. Of all the things that are constant, that always have been, are, and will be true, is the golden ratio. It is a difference between what is and what isn't in a proportion that is consistent throughout nature. So to say that it's kind of like the eternal yin and yang, you can't have light without darkness. You can't have gravity without matter. Although you can't touch gravity. Gravity is immaterial. The yin and the yang. You have to have opposition, otherwise you're a one-sided force. So when you talk about the differences between 2 different things, it's almost like the duality of man's thought, his personality. Go back to Freud and what's the other guy's name? The guy who used to be the antagonist to Freud. Anyway, the idea that you have these 2 little voices, one on the left hand and one on the right hand, and one is good and one is bad. You have to have a balance. And life as we know it is all about maintaining that balance. And it's like a rope that you're wiggling. You're going to go from high to low. There's a certain pendulum that swings. Dan last time was talking about this slope, this kind of a curve that we go through sociologically and politically and economically. I think we're right on course.
So how does that relate to equality or inequality?
Well, inequality and equality are a perspective. A balance is a balance is a balance. However, it's almost kind of like trying to find the edge on a razor. Bill Murray had a movie about that called The Razor's Edge. Anyway, it's very difficult to walk on a razor's edge without cutting yourself. I know that you're always going to be stepping on one side or the other to get from one end of the razor's edge to the other. You're always going to be stepping on one side or the other. You'll never be in balance. It is the art of keeping your balance, which is like in the Constitution. It's a pursuit of happiness. Happiness is never truly attained. If it is attained, it's only temporary.
I like that pursuit. I think that's like struggle. I think struggle is key. You have to struggle.
Yeah.
You have to pursue.
That's true. I believe that, I personally believe that there was another movie with Bruce Dern, who it was a very dark movie. I can't remember the name of it. It might have been Tattoo, but he was cited as a very unstable individual, and he was labeled a paranoiac. And he says, perfect paranoia is perfect awareness. And you give that a certain amount of thought, and it's like, yes, if you're afraid of everything, you are intently focused on being aware of all the dangers. So it's kind of like you want safety, but you recognize it's an unsafe world. And you're always going to have to be looking out for the evil in the world so you can maintain the good.
To put it simply, I think inequality is the human condition.
I agree. Yeah.
And back to my individualism, I detest the drug culture And what has that done to the individual lives of people? And what's behind it? What's behind trying to kill off individualism? Where did all this drug? When I was growing up, we had alcohol, but we didn't have an alcohol culture.
Are you sure?
Yes. It doesn't nearly compare with the drug culture and the lives that drugs have ruined.
Well, odd you should bring that up. A lot of times I get infuriated at the mainstream media. And there was a movie most people are familiar with called Network with Peter Finch. And in there, he had a meltdown at the 6 o'clock news. And he says, you know, what you are seeing on this TV is not reality. It's all garbage. It's all BS. It's a political, economically political driven feed that is geared to get you to think in a certain particular way. And if I were you, I'd go out to my window, I'd lift it up, I'd stick my head out of the window, and I would say I was mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And
yeah,
and in that thing, when you're talking about the perception of our culture and saying it is a drug culture, my guess is if you go into
there is a drug culture. I didn't say it's our culture totally.
I understand. Well, being careful not to paint a society with a broad stroke, to isolate it to the factions. I don't watch police shows because it's rats in a cage and it's all about New York City or Chicago, and it's like I got Major League Baseball to watch and I don't have time for that crap. You can be selective on the type of reality that you want to be living in. If you want to be a crusader to talk about the ISIS or Al Qaeda or the starving children in Africa or Honduras and the bloodshed there, you can pick just about anything that you want as long as you understand that's your war. That's what you want your world to be. And if you go out into space, you'll find that it remains indifferent.
Okay, the drug culture is the equivalent of groupthink,
True.
which is liberalism.
It can be.
Collectivism.
Yes.
Same thing.
Uh-huh.
And it's just something that I wish I could help steer a different way. I don't know how to keep young people from going on drugs, because once they're addicted, it's almost impossible.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, which is actually food for a whole nother talk. But
What time is it?
it's 4:53.
Oh,
So, in another talk, I was raised by a wonderful mother, my adoptive mother, and she couldn't have children, so that's why she adopted me. And she didn't know anything about having children because she had never had any children. She had been a child, but she said, well, where do I go for guidance on being a child? Because they didn't teach me squat in school, and they still don't. So she did her homework and looked at Reader's Digest and went to the library and discovered a man by the name of Benjamin Spock. And he wrote The Baby Book. And to this day, it is probably one of the best books on child raising that was ever written. A lot of people disagree with that, because just like they don't like tiger moms from China who are very disciplinarian in raising their children, Dr. Spock and the Spock Baby Book are responsible for the greater portion of the adults over 50 and 60 and 70 years old today. And we did a really good thing until we got to the baby boom generation, and then it all kind of fell apart.
and the welfare state has done a good job in decreasing the influence of the family.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Yeah.
It's greatly missing. And
Especially Black America.
right. And drugs are just so involved in that whole scene. the welfare state needs to be dismantled. What do you think of that?
In gradual steps. As I mentioned our talk to some people last time when we started talking about the evils of socialism, they says, well, then you should probably get off of Medicare and you should give up your VA pension and don't do Social Security. No. Now, see, we're taking the baby with the bathwater. There is an incremental need for socialist structures.
Steps are fine, but we're not taking steps.
I understand that too.
Right.
Yeah.
So for next time, this scam, postmodernism, that's being taught in colleges and universities. In the 1960s, communists knew they weren't going to win. They had to take the West apart, everything. And they're doing this, they're teaching this postmodernism in our universities and determining the course of our society. It's having a great influence. What do you know about it?
I'm only familiar with the term. I don't know a lot.
It's not a philosophy to govern, it's a philosophy to destroy.
We're talking
postmodernism.
Anarchy?
It seeks to obliterate all authority, history, truth, and language.
Oh, this is like Mao.
There is no truth.
This is like Maoism? Is this like Maoism?
You tell me.
Well, Mao destroyed the Chinese culture because he says...
Its enemy is power.
Yeah.
And institutions of power. Police, courts, school system. Roots in Marxism. But it rejects master narratives as legitimation. Logic and evidence are subjective. You can't prove anything. It's a complete nihilism. Nothing matters. Feelings are deeper than logic, and your feelings say socialism.
Well, these people haven't learned to work for a living, have they?
Exactly. Exactly. So, postmodernism destroy all power, so you're left with nothing.
Well, it's really interesting. They have this these reality shows. The Survivor is one of them, and Naked and Afraid is another. And you kind of wonder, if these aren't just in your face. Like if you have to survive with just your wits alone on a desert island or in a jungle someplace, what are you going to do? And well, it readily comes apparent you can succeed or fail by your ability to get along with the guys or the woman or man you're with, and your basic instincts about how to keep yourself from being eaten. And I think that sounds like a postmodern world to me.
Contradiction is a form of destruction. This is their belief.
45 seconds left.
Ultimately, nothing matters. Nihilism, no right. There's no right and wrong.
These are spoiled children that didn't get enough attention.
No objective reality. Cultural relativism.
Mom and Dad are too busy working to pay attention to me. I'll have to figure this out on my own and put it with whatever world they're living in, because it isn't mine.
So if you would look into the huge effect of this in the universities,
Sure.
It's very widespread.
Is this part and parcel of what's going on in Portland?
I don't know. Check it out.
Okay. I've heard some stories. Sounds like what's going on up there.
Only the now exists. There is no human nature.
Ooh, that sounds like, what was his name? Sartre. Existentialism.
Reality is created by language which is meaningless and social.
Semantics. Yes.
Postmodernism tells us what life is not. Dispels most pathways to truth. Feelings are more legitimate than logic. rejects
yeah.
morality.
That's a Spock and Kirk argument.
Characterized by sarcasm.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Is that it?
That's good.
So we'll keep going on this next time.
All right. This is KFUG. Whatever what's our frequency? 101.1?
Right.
Hey, 101.1 FM, Crescent City, KFUG. And it was a pleasure to be with you, Joan.
Great. You did a great job.
All right. We'll look forward to another lively discussion.
So we probably won't do it next Sunday, but maybe the fall. We won't be on every Sunday, right?
Yeah. Every other Sunday?
Every other Sunday.
Yeah, you'll have your people talk to my people?
Yeah.
Okay. So long, Crescent City, Delaware County.